If you could please outline for us what the objective of these reforms are and how you see things evolving in the early part of this reform journey.
Before I talk about the objective of the reform and the content of the reform, a good place to start perhaps is to maybe place it in a context and talk a little bit about the challenge that we faced and where we were before the reform. You see, in Ethiopia, there was sustained economic development for past 2 decades, but much of that investment was driven and supported by public investment, essentially. And I mean, there is nothing fundamentally wrong with that. There's some merit to it, so I don't want to debate that this particular point. But if you look at the source of the public investment growth in Ethiopia, principally it has 3 sources. I think the first is external creditors. The second source of financing was our largest bank, the systematically important bank in Ethiopia, the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia. And the third source of finance was the National Bank of Ethiopia itself, the central bank. So these 3 sources of finance and credit reached their limit, number 1. And number 2, they brought distinctive problems. For example, in terms of external creditors, it led to building up of external debt, including challenge in terms of debt servicing. In the case of the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia, although it comes with cheap financing, it comes at the cost of credit to the private sector. And even importantly, it led to financial instability risk because CBE was lending essentially to public commercial companies, to public enterprises in Ethiopia. And financing by the central bank, the monetary financing by the central bank led to inflationary pressures because of the monetary expansion. So that was essentially the situation. In addition to that, in Ethiopia's case, we have a very controlled FX regime that led to misalignment and also to significant BOP deficit and to dwindling reserves. So if you combine all of this, then you are faced with sort of classic, typical symptoms of issues, problems, imbalances that requires macro stabilization program. So that's where we were before the reform. So in terms of what was we're trying to achieve, the objective of the reform, essentially the objective of the reform was to address fundamentally, boldly, and conclusively the source of the macro instability in Ethiopia. So that is the first objective of the reform program that we launched in Ethiopia. But second, and the most important part is to actually create a much more open, investment-friendly, and private sector-friendly environment in Ethiopia that would help us in our job creation agenda, that will increase income and improve livelihood. So eventually, that was the goal, and that was the goal of our reforms. That was the goal of the macro stabilization agenda at the end of the day. So what did you do? I mean, essentially, all this happens before even we started an IMF support program. And we know, these issues need to be boldly and clearly confronted. If you don't confront them, then that model, whatever the merit of the policies, is not sustainable. So we have to actually make course correction because old model was not, simply sustainable. So what we did was, immediately after the political transition in Ethiopia led by the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, we started crafting our policy reform program, the so-called homegrown economic reform program in 2019, essentially outlining these core problems and core issues and trying to come up with a reform program to address them. So that's what we did. And unlike other countries, the reform program in Ethiopia was developed by the government. And this is a reform program that we fully own. So we went to IMF, we went to our partners after we developed this overarching reform program. So it's not that we have any difference on the basic objective of the program. In fact, what we are trying to achieve and the support we sought at that time was essentially fully aligned. So this is a reform program that was fully owned by the government. So we drafted the homegrown economic reform program, and we start implementing it. So in terms of the content of the reform itself, it's a much coordinated, comprehensive program where there is a coherence between different policy initiatives. So we have a macro piece to it, where we try to address, conclusively the source of the macro instability. There is a structural piece to it, where we try to improve the investment climate and also address structural reform in telecom, in energy. And there's also, obviously, a sectoral element to it, where we want to diversify source of growth. So the homegrown economic reform program was developed in response to the macro challenge that we faced. In our view, making this kind of transition and course correction is important. It's important, one, as a matter of necessity. The old model was not sustainable. But it's also as a matter of choice. We want to have a source of growth that will drive the Ethiopian economy in a sustainable fashion. We want to increase the scope and the participation of the private sector. So it's a reform program that was launched both as a matter of choice and also as a matter of necessity, simply because the old model was not sustainable.
Thank you, Mamo. That's very helpful diagnostics and context. So, narrowing things down to the monetary sector, what, in your view, will it entail to modernize the monetary framework? What does it mean to have a more market-friendly approach to how exchange rate is allocated?
Yeah, let me just start with what we try to do on the monetary policy front. And I think the core of our macro reform is the work that we did on monetary policy front, not because we are the central bank, but because the reform on the monetary policy front goes straight to the fundamental source of the macro instability in Ethiopia, which is the inflation problem. So the monetary policy reform was, in so many ways, historic in Ethiopia. If people in the room, if you look at that reform, most of the ideas that we see might not be new, but in Ethiopia, the reform that we did on the monetary policy reform is a significant catching up with peer countries in so many ways. So we've done a number of unique initiatives that you can consider in Ethiopia context first. For example, we revised the Central Bank Act proclamation, we call it proclamation in Ethiopia, that put price stability as the primary goal of the central bank. So price stability is the most defining, the most important goal of the central bank in the hierarchy of objectives that we have. So this is a first of its kind. The previous central bank that doesn't have this kind of clarity in the role of the central bank. The second thing is, for the first time, we introduced a central bank policy rate, which we would tighten or loosen to, of course, to recalibrate the monetary conditions in the economy. The third thing that we did was we introduced new instruments for the first time. For example, we started an open market operation in Ethiopia for the first time, which, by the way, is functioning quite well in the last 9 months. So we have conducted more than 12 liquidity observing operations and going very, very well. The fourth step that we took was to create an interbank, electronic interbank money market, which would allow banks to borrow and lend to each other to manage their liquidity. All these initiatives are new in Ethiopia. There was no this kind of initiative and reform before what we're trying to do on the monetary policy front. And of course, we also established a monetary policy committee as part of our legislative reform. And the committee will independently review developments in the economy and make recommendations on interest rate. All of this was in Ethiopia, and all of this were done in the past 9 months. So what was the result? What are the results? Of course, there is significant work ahead of us, but we've seen clear outcome coming out of it. I think the first thing I would say is, because the primary role of the central bank and the primary objective of central banks is to reduce inflation, in Ethiopia's case, for the last 3 consecutive years, inflation was about 30%. But because of the tight monetary policy that we are implementing in Ethiopia, we managed to reduce inflation from 30% to 13% in March. So that was an important progress. And our hope is in the next fiscal year, inflation will reach 10%. And if we achieve that, this will be the first in 10 years in Ethiopia. So obviously it's delivering result. Second thing I would say is because of the monetary policy measures that we are taking, if you currently look at, for the first time in Ethiopia, we hope to finish this fiscal year, with zero central bank credit to the treasury, with no monetary financing of the budget for the first time in 12 years. That we're trying to achieve. And this goes to show the strength of our monetary policy regime, and also, of course, prudent fiscal management on the part of Treasury as well. So for the first time, we think there will be no direct lending or credit from central bank to the Treasury. But the third important outcome of this new monetary policy regime is that key interest rates in Ethiopia are now positive in real terms for the first time in decades. The national bank rate, policy rate is positive, real positive for the first time. The interbank money market rate is positive. The treasury bill rate is positive. All this would improve the attractiveness of birr asset holdings, local currency holdings in Ethiopia. So this is also an important achievement. Gradually, we are also addressing financial repression in Ethiopia. We are making credit available for the private sector, simply because we want to have a balanced growth in Ethiopia. Much of credit, if you look at the credit situation in Ethiopia right now, close to 80% of new credit goes to the private sector. All this is outcome of this new reform that we're undertaking in Ethiopia, and the result so far is satisfactory. I'm not saying that everything is perfect, because there are work ahead of us, and we'll continue in this stage, of course. But there is real tangible outcomes coming out of this reform on the monetary policy front.
Thank you so much. I mean, you've pointed to really very tangible results, but that have been delivered so far, and it's one we have been following keenly, of course, and seeing quite a bit of progress on. But if I could ask, perhaps the part that has excited people, or at least got a lot of attention, is the aspect that has had to do with trying to address the foreign exchange imbalances that the country's been facing now. Can I ask, how do you see the new FX regime evolving right now? What have been the challenges, and what have you been trying to do to work in the new dispensation?
I think first of all, I want to set the context and just talk a little bit about the exchange rate reform in Ethiopia. I think what we did in Ethiopia is not just a shift toward this market-based exchange rate regime. That's not the reform. Most people assume that's the reform, but in our view, that's not the reform. What happened in Ethiopia is a full-scale liberalization of the FX regime for the first time in 5 decades. By this I mean, first of all, we moved from a controlled regime to a market-based exchange rate regime. That's one element of the reform. But in addition to that, we've taken a number of measures, regulatory rationalization measures, where we address a number of barriers to productivity and growth in Ethiopia. On the FX regime, we used to have close to, in our accounting, close to 87 different directives regulating the Ethiopian FX regime that were accumulating for the past 5 decades. All of this were streamlined and rationalized, and we now have one single directive regulating FX regime in Ethiopia, accessible, easy to understand for anyone operating in the Ethiopian economy. And within that regulation, we eliminated the so-called surrender requirement to the central bank, meaning banks are no longer required to surrender their foreign currency to the central bank. We significantly made it easy for companies to access external credit. We allowed new operators in the FX market, FX bureaus, to operate in Ethiopia. All sorts of new measures. We allowed foreign investment, portfolio investment, to participate in the capital market in Ethiopia. So we completely rationalized and reformed the exchange rate regime. The reason is that we are doing this is because we know this misaligned exchange rate regime, this controlled exchange rate regime was not delivering the result we wanted. It was very, very difficult for the private sector, particularly the manufacturing sector, to access foreign currency. If they don't have the foreign currency, then they will not be able to, produce and, and operate at capacity. So at the end of the day, the point of the FX reform is to increase the inflow and also to make it easy for the private sector to access foreign currencies. That was the goal of the reform, and that's why we will still stay the course when it comes to this reform, because we paid a cost, we paid a price, and we want to make sure that this reform delivers. I also want to talk about, if you permit me, to talk about the result of the reform, the FX reform, the early results. The outcome of the reform is beyond our expectation. For example, the first outcome of it is the supply response. The FX supply response has dramatically increased. Export this year in Ethiopia will increase minimum by 100%. It literally will double. Remittance will increase by at least 25%.
So how much is this actual remittances going up versus money moving from informal to more formal channels?
Well, I think it's both. I mean, we see the remittance inflow in the banking sector now, so we monitor that. And when you monitor that, so essentially we see a significant increase in inflow. But the important thing is the export performance. The export performance is literally increased by 100%, so that we are very, very happy with that. And also, the biggest problem in Ethiopia, and I said that as a central bank governor, one of the most serious issues that we faced before the reform was the dwindling and the falling reserve that we have to worry about on a daily basis. So if you look at reserve, after the reform, our reserve level increased threefold. The reserve at the banking system increased twofold. So again, there is clear impact of this reform in terms of increasing and boosting the inflow into the economy. But even more importantly, and for me that's the most satisfying thing, is that the private sector is now finding it easy to access foreign currency. And that's precisely what this kind of reform is supposed to achieve. Of course, when I say this, I'm not saying everything's perfect, but in policy making, you have to constantly monitor. If there are problems that are surfacing, then you address them by properly understanding the root cause of those problems, and then recalibrate policy accordingly. So we are constantly vigilant. We are constantly seeing how the market is functioning. I think there's some work to be done in terms of deepening the market. There's some work to be done in terms of fostering competition among the banks in Ethiopia. But definitely we'll stay on course and really achieve the core objective of the FX reform in Ethiopia.
Thank you so much, Mamo. One of the things that I've been struck by is how much of an effort you've been making to communicate around these reforms as a national bank, which is not something that we are good at in the region overall, and I don't think we've seen as much commitment to communication as NBE has shown in the last several years. If I could ask, so you've done the policy reforms. You said like a lot of the reforms have been really fundamental and deep-rooted reforms to the money market, to bond market, etc. But the focus, people tend to be, like me, reductive and looking out certain variables. For example, the gap between the official exchange rate now and the parallel market rate. So reductive in terms of assessing outcomes in that way. So, how do you communicate around this? How do you, how do you approach this challenge to make sure that the reforms are getting traction, to show that the reforms are indeed advancing towards the objective that you've set yourself?
So I think at the central bank we are investing in a significant amount of time and energy in trying to get the message out to the public. Because that is how you buy credibility, and we want to approach it with integrity. We closely watch the market dynamics and do what we said we would be doing. I think credibility of the central bank is very, very important. So every day you have to earn that trust by the public. And people need to understand that we are approaching this with utmost professionalism and integrity. So that message we're constantly getting out of the central bank. But I will address this issue. At a fundamental level, the reform is functioning quite well. But remember, we're trying to change a policy that was in place and that was entrenched for the past 5 decades, almost 50 years. So it's very difficult to, go to a smooth, orderly, functioning, efficient market, quickly. There's so much learning that needs to happen by the central bank, by the banking sector, by market participants. So we are aware of that, and we're not panicking in any way. We are actually, we think we can actually observe, understand the root causes without necessarily, leaping into action, and have some comfort in living with some sort of uncertainty and ambiguity for a little bit until you understand what the real causes of, some of the changes that you see in the market. So sometimes, depending on seasonality, you see, this shift, the interest rate, the exchange rate will have to shift based on BOP conditions, right? So, for example, in the past couple of months in Ethiopia, it is, a season where there is significant import of fertilizer into the Ethiopian economy because it's an agricultural country. As some, in some months, there will be a significant import of fertilizer, and depending on that seasonality, the premium might increase or decrease. So we are constantly trying to understand what the causes are and take corrective measures after that and learn from that process. And I think we will definitely handle it. We have a set of policy ideas that we will be taking, particularly because of the overperformance of the export, particularly the gold overperformance, the biggest export in Ethiopia. We will be in a position to sell part of the extra performance in gold receipt to the market. So things are now stabilizing, but I think the most important skill that one needs to have in this case is to be watchful, to be vigilant, to really observe how the market functions.
Thank you so much. One question I like to ask is, what has surprised you on the positive front, and what has surprised you on the perhaps more negative front in the reforms that you've done so far? I guess strong export performance is amongst the positive surprises. Is there anything that surprised you as you've been advancing these really fundamental reforms?
I think the correlation that I took from this experience is, for me, the importance of taking your time to prepare. In Ethiopia, we took significant amount of time preparing internally, doing analysis, consulting among different government agencies. And for outsiders, this could be frustrating. But for us, the amount of time that we invested preparing internally and coordinating among different government agencies is important. So I think the key point is not what we did, but how we did it. So in that sense, I think there is meaningful coordination, for example, in Ethiopia, between the fiscal and the monetary authority. The reform that we are undertaking in Ethiopia is not a reform by the central bank. It has a whole of government approach to it. So that's the first thing that I would say. Second thing is, the investment in terms of communication. We talked about this. Also, it's very important to try to sequence reforms. In our case, for example, before the exchange rate reform on July 29, that was preceded by tight monetary and fiscal policy measures in July 2023. So we started the reform a year before we announced the exchange rate reform. So there is a sequencing element to it. Even after the reform, some of the subsidies were not eliminated immediately. We want to sequence it in a proper way. So I think sequencing would be another important lesson that we learn from this. And finally, I would say this. I think it's very important to develop sort of adaptive skill in the sense that whenever problems surface, I think it's important to sit with that, to sit with ambiguity, to sit with uncertainty, because things might not go according to plan. And I think the important skill to have is really to do diagnosis regularly and to take corrective measures and learn from it. If it doesn't work out, change your approach. I think that kind of mindset for us is really, really important.
We've been so focused on the monetary policy, the FX regime issues, that I have not asked you about the changes to the overall financial sector landscape that you've also ushered in? You talked about the central bank law, but there are also quite significant reforms with respect to the rest of the financial sector, the banking sector in particular. Can you say a little bit about what the objective of those reforms are, where you hope to be in the coming months there also?
Yeah. So again, on the financial sector, there is significant reform. I think the first important reform is the revision of the Central Bank Act itself. This is something that we've done for the first time after 2 decades. There, we made price stability to be the core objective. Second thing is we opened up the Ethiopian financial sector to foreign competition. So the so-called new banking business proclamations that allowed foreigners to operate in Ethiopia. But even critically, we took measures to ensure the stability of the financial sector by capitalizing the most important, the systematically important bank in Ethiopia, the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia. And we are also currently taking measures in terms of financial deepening, financial inclusion, and digitization efforts. I mean, I can go in detail on all of these issues, but I think, for us, all the reform measures that we took in Ethiopia are coherent and coordinated. It's not just a monetary policy reform, it's also an FX reform, it's also a financial sector reform. It's also an institutional reform, and there are also similar work that's happening at the Treasury in terms of fiscal consolidation.
What's next? What are the set of reforms that you're hoping to work on in the coming months?
The first thing is we have to deepen the current reform initiatives. There's more work to be done on the monetary policy front by shifting towards a full-fledged interest-based monetary policy. We want to work in terms of deepening the FX market. And most importantly, we have to conclusively address the source of macro instability and invest in a strong macro foundation. That would be an important precondition for growth in Ethiopia. And of course, Ethiopia is one of the largest economy in the African continent, the 3rd largest economy in the African continent. So with this strong macro investment, we think we can sustain productivity, we can sustain growth, we can attract more private capital into the country in the years ahead.